Thank you for having me. I'm just going to set myself up here for a second, if this works. Okay, normally I need to give a 15-20 minute talk summarizing behavioral economics, which is a 25-year-old field that thousands of researchers work on. So as you can imagine, 15 minutes isn't enough. Today I just need to give a 15-minute talk summarizing something I spent 4 years on, so significantly easier lift. So let me tell you what the book and the ideas behind it are about. I got started in this area of development working largely in financial inclusion. It was a privilege to work with people like Jonathan Morduck at the Financial Access Initiative or Bindu Anand at IFMR. And there's a lot of field work that was done around poverty. And this is an attempt to understand what it means to be poor. So I know there's a lot of discussion of understanding clients' needs. So what I want you to do for the rest of this talk is to put aside financial access, financial inclusion, everything, and just take a step back and ask yourself, what does it mean to be poor? And then I want to tell you a little bit about what I think might be an answer to that question that's different than what I think most people give as an answer to that question. And so to that link, let me start with an example of a behavior, nothing to do with finance. I'm not going to talk about finance for about 15 minutes. So let me start with a behavior that has nothing to do with finance, but is pretty important. So diabetes is a deadly disease, pretty bad. It basically rots you from the inside is a good way of thinking about it. Too much sugar. So diabetes therefore leads to blindness. It leads to limb loss. You have to chop off arms. But luckily we had these drugs, which were actually one of the first categories, along with antibiotics, were the first miracle drugs. They were miracle drugs because they turned this deadly disease into something manageable. All you had to do was take this. This is an injection. Nowadays, the injections are very easy. There are pills. Pretty solved. But something's wrong. These drugs aren't working. And these drugs aren't working. Well, it's a salient example. About 100,000 people in the US lose limbs, have an arm chopped off because of diabetes every year. So something's going wrong. And what's going wrong isn't tuberculosis, drugs not working anymore. It's not that diabetes is suddenly getting very strong against the drugs we've given it. Something else is happening. And this is very biological, so I hope you all remember your biology training. It turns out that for drugs to work, people have to take them. And people are not taking them. Drug adherence for diabetes is about 65%, 66%. This is true not just for diabetes, HIV. Drug adherence is anywhere between 85 and 90%. Take any category of illness, death sentences that we give people. Tuberculosis, the biggest problem with TB is if we just give people antibiotics, guess what they do? They take it for a while and then they say, I've had it with this. What's going on? Well, before understanding that, let me just tell you, public health researchers have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on. And one thing that's in their data, which shows up, it's not really what they study necessarily, but it shows up again and again, is there's a great predictor of who doesn't take their medication. The poor. Let me go to another area, parenting. There are a lot of sociologists who study parenting. What does it take to be a good parent? They do it in lots of funny ways. One of the funniest ways is they'll send someone to the house. That person sits in the corner and takes notes. In my mind, this person is wearing a white lab coat and is basically, anyway, I have a lot of visions. That's one of them. But the point is that they now have a pretty good understanding of what makes for a good parent. And it turns out some people are not good parents. I mean, none of you, but there are other people out there who are not good parents. And those people are, for example, people who don't spend that much time with their kids. Or even worse, they're very inconsistent. They'll say one thing one day and another thing another day. So there are a lot of such behaviors. And guess what turns out to be a good predictor of being a bad parent? Being poor. Let's go to another area. Let's go to agriculture. There are some very simple innovations that we now have that can yield crop output by about 25% at least, okay? This is an unbelievable innovation. It's called weeding. People don't weed enough. Not everybody. Some farmers weed perfectly. Some farmers just don't weed as much as they should. Guess who doesn't weed as often as they should? The poor. I can keep going like this, and it gets to be a litany. It almost seems like that T.S. Eliot poem, it seems like I have something of insidious intent, but it's true. Pick a behavior that you think is good. Go and measure it. You'll find some people don't do it. And guess what will predict who doesn't do it? Poverty. This is disturbing, and it should disturb all of you because it suggests there's some deep link between poverty and behavior. And if we really want to understand poverty, it means that if we just look at any one thing, the public health expert just looking at their narrower domain is going to be looking for their little explanations. But if it's true for parenting, for weeding, for vaccination, for everything, all of a sudden it must mean that there's something common, something more primitive that underlies all of this. So what are these links? Well, one possibility is there's a bunch of stuff going on. Look, I don't know if you know this, but there's a field, it's called economics. It says that when things cost more, people don't use it. The poor don't have money. Big surprise, they don't use drugs that cost money. Why are you telling us all this? Well, that does work for some things, but that link gets tenuous for a lot of things. Being consistent as a parent doesn't cost money. There are a lot of behaviors that have no price associated, which the poor still do less of. We could go on, knowledge. Maybe the poor just don't know that this drug has value. Sure, but you know what? Weeding's been known to have benefits for about 1,000 years. It's not a lack of knowledge. No farmer is going to say, weeding, what good is that? They know. We go another route. So this is sort of what I call the potpourri route. Another route is to say, oh, you're overcomplicating it. Really, here's what's going on. The poor are incompetent. They're low intelligence. In fact, let me go further and say, why do you think they're poor to begin with? They're not smart. They're the people who don't have their act together. They're the people who would eat the marshmallow. So that's one way to go. But we can keep going. There is no shortage of explanations in the world of poverty. I want to break these up into two categories for you. The first explanation is what I just finished on, individual differences. The poor are somehow different as people. They are different people, and that's where the problem lies. Another explanation is there's something about the environment the poor live in, and yes, I have to resort to a different environmental variable each time, but so what? It's fine. The former, individual differences, is unsatisfying just because, for me at least, it just doesn't resonate. The latter is unsatisfying in that really every new thing you want a new explanation for, that seems unsatisfying. So today I'm going to try and offer to you a different explanation. The explanation is, in a way, trivial, but I think it's been useful for me. Here's the trivial observation. Poverty, whoever is experiencing it, creates a particular psychology, creates a particular mindset. If any of you tomorrow were to become poor, you would experience the exact same mindset. It's not a difference between poor people and rich people. It's the fact that poverty causes a certain mindset. And that mindset, I'm going to argue, creates all of these behaviors. So what is that mindset? To understand that mindset, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back in time to an interesting study that was conducted in the 1940s. So this was at the turn of World War II, and what was happening was that the Allies were starting to recapture large parts of Europe. And what they found there was a lot of people who were starving. And they wanted to know, how do we refeed these people? It's a pretty good question, because after all, you could say, give them all the food they want. Maybe that's bad. Maybe that's a shock to the system. Maybe we should sort of lengthen it out and give them little by little. And they wanted to know. They had a lot of food, a lot of starving people. What should we do? So they went and they asked the scientists of their time. The scientists said, we don't know, but let us run an experiment for you. And that's what they did. They ran an experiment. The experiment was called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment. They brought a bunch of men, because to figure out how you refeed people, the first thing you have to do is starve them. So this is an example of a subject from that study. There he is at the beginning of the study, and on the left is there he is about 4 months in. He's starving. The Minnesota Starvation Experiment taught us a lot about hunger. I won't go through many of the wonderful physiological things that it taught us, but in the footnotes of that study is what I'm going to argue is the psychology of poverty and the psychology of scarcity. These men were experiencing scarcity, a scarcity of food. What did it do to their minds? Well, being hungry does something to you. For example, these men became cranky. That's not particularly interesting. Any of you who've been around somebody who hasn't had their lunch will know. No, something else happened. And perhaps the best illustration of this was, what would these men do with their free time? They had a lot of free time. They lived in these dorms. They were just there being studied. They would look at cookbooks for hours on end. Here's another thing. When asked, what are you going to do when you leave this experiment? More than half of them said, I'm going to start a restaurant. Now, I hate to be the spoiler here, but half of these men did not start a restaurant. Why were they doing these things? Because when they were hungry, what was top of mind? What is it that their mind kept going back to? Food. There's a great scene, one of the authors writes about this. He goes to a movie, and the movie theater is much like this, and in one corner is where the participants are sitting. And he said, it was funny. Sometimes they'd laugh, but many times when there was a punchline, they'd just sit there dead silent while the rest of the theater laughed. And he finally pieced together what it was. Pieced together that if there was food on the screen, these men didn't even hear the punchline, because the food occupied their mind. Now, we know now with other studies that there are other ways this can happen. A recent study, for example, about 10 years ago, brought subjects into the lab and said, don't drink anything for about 6 hours before coming in. And then, to half of them, they gave water, and to the other half, they gave pretzels. Psychology is a very cruel field. Right after they gave them pretzels, they said, we're going to have you do a very simple task, It's called the lexical decision task. Here it is. Letters are going to flash on the screen. We want you to tell us, is it a word or not? Okay, so like, for example, that's a word. Not a word. Word. You see how this is going. I did this once. I still have to fix these slides. And I did this in Norway once, and I started to wonder, is this all going to go badly? But nevertheless, I now know those are also not Norwegian words, in case. So if you learn nothing from this talk, you will have learned that. And now what did they find? Well, this is the most trivial task you could come up with. I'm going to give you one more trivial one. Is it a word? Obviously. No, yes, no, yes. But how quickly you respond to that question is actually indicative of what's top of mind. Differences in response times are on the order of about 50 to 100 milliseconds. Conscious control stops at 300 milliseconds. I know some of you think, oh, I'm really quick. But even you, below 300 milliseconds, you can't control what your mind does. These are unconscious responses. And what we find is that both the well-sated and the thirsty respond equally well to chair. But the thirsty are very quick to see the word water. Much quicker. That's the heart of what I'm going to tell you today. That scarcity, when we lack something, that thing automatically captures our mind. It keeps going back there. Now, I want to say one thing. This you might think of as having a very primitive evolutionary benefit. After all, if you're hungry, you can imagine why your body might be designed such that a little part of your brain says, I'm not sure what you're doing right now, but we're hungry. You might be interested in this little piece of information, we're starving. So that your mind keeps going back has some primitive advantages. The first thing to realize about the psychology of scarcity is it has benefits. The poor, I'm going to argue, keep thinking about finances. As a result, they're much better at their finances than any of you. Here's an example, and I'm going to argue this very clearly. Anytime you don't believe me, just go to a supermarket, wait outside. When somebody comes out, ask for their receipt and say, hey, I just noticed you bought Crest toothpaste. I'll say, yeah. I'll say, how much did that cost? Now, if you do that with rich people, they'll say, I think it was $2, maybe $5, could be $7. I'm pretty sure it was less than 10. Ask a poor person, they'll say $3.95, it's on sale, normally it's $4.35. Because the poor are thinking about their needs and their finances. The poor, for example, in a survey, we asked people in Boston, what's the taxi fare when you first get in? The meter starts at a certain level. The high SES are much less likely to know the answer to that question than the poor SES. These are the percentage getting it right. And guess who doesn't take taxis? The poor. The people on the right, they get in taxis hundreds of times. They don't even notice. They're like, oh, that's you, that's me. This is just one reminder that when we talk about financial capability, there is a deep sense in which the poor have greater financial capability than us. I guarantee you about that. That doesn't mean they have all the capability they need to navigate a complex world, but they've got a lot, which changes the way you should be thinking about how you might want to do financial education. But all is not good. There are some negative consequences. Poverty does have this bad behavior. So where does this come from? Let me give you an experiment that tells you how this simple going back, conscious, subconscious, unconscious, attentional capture by the needs ends up having these negative consequences. I'm going to do this by virtue of a little word search experiment. Here's something we did. We had subject look for the words on the right. Okay? That was half the subjects. The other half, we replaced every other word. So street was replaced with cake. Picture was replaced with donut. I think you see where I'm going with this. These were delicious replacements. And what we really wanted to know was how quickly would somebody find, say, the word cloud if before that they just saw the word picture or if they just saw the word donut. Turns out for about half of our subjects, it didn't make a difference. As quick to find the word cloud if they saw a picture or if they saw a donut. But for about half of them, it did make a difference. Guess which half? Guess who these people were? Dieters. See, here are the non-dieters. The dieters, oh, donut? Wait, was there a donut here? It was as if that donut, that cake was still on their mind while they were searching for cloud. That's the essence of what I want to tell you. If you have something on your mind, you're a lot less productive at the task. You're a lot less engaged at the task you're trying to focus on right now. This has huge consequences. I'm going to show you these consequences fairly quickly. First, I'm going to show you what the biggest consequence of this is. We went to a mall in New Jersey and we surveyed poor and rich. And we tested them on two of the most fundamental cognitive functions ever. One is called fluid intelligence. This is the basis of all decision making. You test this using a thing called Ravens, which I won't go into, but you've all taken these and promptly forgotten because it was a painful experience. But you took this is how we decided what your IQ was. The second one is a little more fun, and to test that, it's a little related to the marshmallow experiment. I want you to test it with me. I'm going to put a picture on the screen, an object, and I want you to say the color. Ready? Here we go. I'm a little louder. I know you can do this. You probably haven't been paying attention until now, but now's a good time to pay attention. Ready? What is that? Okay, here we go. What is that? Red, green, yellow, blue, red. Yes, that's right. This is called executive control. Marshmallows are about inhibiting high-level responses, but self-control begins with this, executive control. You have an impulse, and can you resist that impulse? It's a very powerful test. It's predictive of behavior, and both of these tests are predictive of every one of those behaviors I've been telling you about. What do? We gave that to these people, but like the donut, we wanted something. We wanted them to start thinking about money. So for half the subjects, before we gave them these tests, we tickled them. Now, it wasn't that kind of tickle, though I asked if I could do that, but apparently there's something called human subjects. Now, we tickled them. The way we tickled them was we gently asked them a question. Hey, if you needed $1,000 and your car was broken, how would you get that money? Hypothetically. That's it. Now, here's what happens. This is how the poor and the rich do on fluid intelligence. Yeah, the poor are a little worse. Tickle them, and all of a sudden, they are much worse. Their IQ drops by about 9 points. I'll come back to how big that is in a second. Same thing with how well they do at avoiding impulse control. A little worse than the rich, make them think a little bit about money, and all of a sudden, much worse. I'll tell you one last study. We did the same thing that I just told you, but instead of going and tickling anybody, we simply went to farmers who farm sugarcane. And we just said, let's get you the month before harvest when you're poor, and get you the month after harvest when you're rich. The same person before and after harvest, poor and rich. We did the same thing. What did you find? That person is significantly smarter post-harvest than they are pre-harvest. Significantly more impulse control. Why do I keep throwing around the word significantly? Mainly to convince you, but because I think the word significant is legitimate here. How big are these effects? Psychologists, like I said, they're funny people. One thing they study is sleep. One psych experiment, for example, a set of psych experiments brings people into the lab. You all would come in, and I'd say, you guys get a good night's sleep. Here is a nice, cool room, quiet, nice bed. You guys, no sleep for you. And just to make sure you don't sleep tonight, I'm sitting next to you, and I'm going to shake you awake if you even doze off. So now you have somebody who's completely not rested, somebody well-rested. The next morning at 9 a.m., I give them both an IQ test. I give them both an impulse control test. And guess what? You guys really do badly. A night of lost sleep is terrible for the brain. Poverty is about 3/4 of that size, our effects. Being poor is like a night of all-night sleep, except you can go to sleep. The poor, every day is like that. These are stunning magnitudes on impacts of intelligence. They are more than big enough to say, this loss in bandwidth affects clear thinking, self-control, memory, learning, creativity, in very large doses. They are more than big enough for us to be able to talk about what the biggest effect of financial inclusion, the biggest effect of changing people's finances, may have nothing to do with dollars and cents. It has to do with fundamentally changing the mind. If I told you I had a program that would allow people to get smarter, you would say, wow, that's an amazing program. And I'd say, Yes, but it's a financial product, because what it does is it takes care of people's everyday needs so that then their mind is clear to think of other things. That would seem like fiction, but in fact, that's what these results suggest. That when we address customer needs, when we are actually solving their fundamental financial needs that they're running around trying to manage mentally, that we are not just changing the landscape of finance, we're changing fundamentally their mind. Okay, let me close there, and then I can take more questions or if there is time. So if there's a question in the audience, I can take one or two. Yeah. Oh, I should have warned you guys I was going to take questions.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. One brief question about your probably last sentence that you said that when they become more rich, they become smarter. What about statistic that often people which win lottery, for example, then they lost all their money anyway. So how you would explain this?
Yeah. So there is, in fact, evidence that when people win the lottery, they spend it badly or they may go back to various amounts. I don't think that has anything to do with poor people. I think anybody given a large lump of money, that's just hard for the mind no matter what. For example, you've all won a lottery. You've won a time lottery. A project that you thought you had due all of a sudden is canceled and now you find a couple of days free. You all said you're very busy. Do you think you were an expert user of this sudden abundance of time? I think that there is an inherent left of that, which is what I think is wrong, which is also what's wrong with the harvest, which is it gives this abundance of money all at once, which is why the farmer ends up poor. But if we can smooth some of these things, I think that'll help everybody. But in this case, it'll get rid of the psychology of scarcity, which is kicking in at the end. Okay, I think, I can't see if my clock is there. Oh, we've got a little bit of time. Okay, is there another question? There's one over there.
Just linking to the previous question, does this make a case for unconditional cash transfers as bringing up poor people to a certain minimum level, income level?
Yeah, so I would say two things. One, when we talk about the policy implications of this, here's one policy implication that I've often found very important, which is conditional cash transfers are shown to have great impact. But the problem with conditionality is that it's using a resource that we don't price. Now, you all run nonprofits or businesses. It would be a horrible accounting system if you had some division using some resource that they weren't being charged for. But as policymakers, you're all using a resource, and as producers of products, you're all using a resource that you never even account for, which is bandwidth. Every condition in a conditional cash transfer is one more condition the person has to think through, figure out, follow through on. That doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile condition, but when you look at most conditional cash transfers, they have dozens of conditions. Now, I think we put them on because we think, well, sure, why not? Why not one more condition? But a lot of our policies tax bandwidth more and more. So the argument I would think for moving more towards unconditional cash is these results do suggest that cash in and of itself has a huge benefit. But I think we can be even more creative than unconditional cash transfers. I think the right loan product brought through at the right time can have a large amount of impact. These results have taught me one thing. It's that we can't think of poverty as this thing, people are poor. The harvest farmers, there are times when they're experiencing scarcity, and there are times when they're not. Pre-harvest, post-harvest. As Jonathan Mordock and his co-authors have shown in Portfolios of the Poor, this is not just harvest. The lives of the poor vary a lot from day to day. There are very high periods where it's like you have to make ends meet. And then there are periods which are more slack. In a way, this might ring true to all of you who experience scarcity of time. You're not always busy, busy, busy. There are days where you have some slack. There are days where you don't. And the same is true of the poor. So even better than conditional cash transfers, I think that targeted interventions that create slack, that create some release in those moments of very high poverty could have unreasonably large effects. Because I think what we have other results to show that some of the biggest mistakes that happen in decisions happen in those periods where people are particularly experienced. So for example, an emergency loan doesn't need to be a big emergency loan. It could be a small emergency loan, but delivered in that day when their bicycle broke down and they're like, what am I going to do? I really need to get to work. So that's the sense in which I think that as we start to unravel a little bit what the lives of the poor are like, we can do things even better than just unconditional transfers. Okay, I think we've got one question left. Yeah. Oh, you were done. Oh, I was looking at this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sendhil Mullainathan.